FolkFear presents in forgotten corners of the world, where candles flicker more than they shine, where silence is sacred and stories are warnings, the dead are never truly gone. Here in FolkFear, we do not chase horror, we listen to it. In whispers passed from toothless grandmothers, in songs sung to infants that should never be sung after dark, we bring you the tales that tremble beneath the surface of folk belief, where rituals go wrong, where customs are not just tradition, but protection. Tonight, we tell the story of the burning coffin, a cursed folk horror tale from deep within the smoke-wrapped hills, where a cremation fire refused to die and the ashes began to glow. Some fires burn out, others remember. And if you listen closely, you might still hear the embers breathing. The village of Bon Sen Noi was barely a smudge on any map, tucked deep between folds of mountains that always looked as though they were exhaling mist. Even the roads seemed reluctant to lead there, narrowing into footpaths where grass reclaimed gravel and branches reached like crooked fingers to pull you back. But for those born beneath its thin red moon and wind-worn rooftops, Bon Sen Noi was not remote. It was close. The villagers spoke in hushed tones, even at weddings. They burned incense every day, not just on holy days. And they bowed toward the cremation ground at dusk, never at dawn, as if there was something sacred about endings and dangerous about beginnings. When the coffin arrived, it was not by cart or foot or prayer. It came in silence. No horses, no monks, no relatives, no name carved into its side, just a heavy, dark box left beside the cremation pit one morning, long before the rooster's call, when the mist was still clinging to the banyan trees like breath on glass. The boy who found it was named Pai. He was 12, barefoot and angry with the world, as boys often are when they are old enough to understand hunger, but too young to be blamed for it. He'd come to the cremation pit to find dry sticks for his mother's morning fire. Instead, he found the box. It was larger than most coffins, made of a wood so dark it looked wet. There were no nails, no rope, no ceremonial cloth wrapped around it, only a red thread tied in a knot at one corner, the kind they use in old mourning rites when the dead must be bound to prevent them from returning. Pai stood very still. The air around the coffin was warm, unnaturally so, not like a fire, more like breath, like something inside had just exhaled mist. And even though it was sealed, he swore he heard the faintest rustle, like ash shifting. He didn't run. That was his first mistake. He reached out and touched it. That was his second. It was warm. Not just the wood, but his skin, which began to tingle as if something ancient had curled around his wrist and tested the beat of his blood. He yanked his hand away, stumbled back, and ran. By the time he reached his home, he said nothing, not to his mother, not to the others. He simply placed the sticks in the fire, watched them catch, and stared at the flame for a long time. Something in him had changed. A kind of quiet had settled in his chest like soot. That evening, the elders gathered near the cremation ground, curious about the mysterious coffin. They were old men with gray hair and quiet habits, each of them marked by the rituals they kept and the silences they maintained. They examined the box without touching it. They circled it 3 times, and they prayed. Then they ordered it burned. No one knew who the dead was, but tradition said all bodies must be returned to flame. To deny a spirit its passage was to invite it to linger, and in Bon Sen Noi, no one wanted that. The pyre was built quickly. Dry teak, bundled reeds, powdered resin to hasten the fire. The coffin was placed atop the wood. The match was lit. The fire was born. It should have been like all the others, a crackling flame that consumed grief, purified sorrow, and released the soul into smoke. But this fire did not burn out. Not in hours, not in days. It roared the first night, high and bright, but come morning it still hissed and danced. By the second day, it was still strong. On the third, the wind blew strange. It carried not smoke, but a scent like burnt flowers and something deeper, the scent of something that should never have been burned at all. By the fourth day, the villagers stopped visiting. By the fifth, the animals refused to pass the pit. By the sixth, the ash was still glowing. Children were told not to look toward the cremation ground, not even in daylight. Some disobeyed. Some cried in their sleep for nights afterward. They said they saw someone standing inside the flame, arms folded, eyes open, unmoving. On the seventh day, Pai went back. He waited until moonrise. He waited until even the crickets were silent. And then he walked barefoot down the slope toward the pyre. The fire was smaller now, but still alive. It no longer danced. It breathed, a pulsing, steady breath, like an old man on the verge of sleep, but never quite surrendering to it. Pai stepped closer. The red thread that had once tied the corner of the coffin was now tangled in a root nearby, still red, still whole, untouched by flame. He bent to pick it up. The instant his fingers closed around it, the fire surged. It didn't explode. It didn't roar. It sighed, as if it recognized him. He stumbled back, heart hammering, thread clenched in his palm. The ash nearest him stirred just a little and glowed with an orange light, as though remembering what it had once held. Then it whispered, not with voice, not with air, but with a thought, ancient and soft. You brought me back. He dropped the thread, but it did not fall. It clung to his palm like silk soaked in sweat. No matter how hard he shook, it wouldn't release. Behind him, someone moved. He turned. There was no one, only smoke, curling like fingers reaching for his face. He ran. This time, he told no one. But in the following days, others began to feel it. The heat that lingered in places untouched by sun. The dreams filled with a coffin that opened only a crack, just enough to show teeth. The smell of burnt wood that clung to clothing no one had worn in years. And then came the ash. It began to drift, not just from the pit, but from rooftops, from shrines, from under floorboards. Ash that glowed, faintly, just enough to see your reflection in it. And sometimes the reflection blinked. The elders sealed the cremation ground. They drew salt lines, buried charms, whispered prayers never spoken aloud. But the fire was still alive, and deep within its heart something waited, not to escape, but to be seen, to be remembered. Because not all coffins bury the dead. Some
keep them warm.
The river that wound through Ban San Noi had no name, at least not one the villagers dared speak. They called it Mae Num Clang, the river in the middle, though no one agreed on what it sat between. Some said it marked the boundary between rice field and forest. Others whispered it was the line between the seen and the unseen. But ever since the fire that would not die, the river changed. It began subtly, a thin haze of ash resting on the surface, too fine to come from any tree. The water, once clear as mirror glass, grew clouded near the banks. The fish, once lively in the early morning, swam slower. And at night, the wind that passed over the fire and slipped down into the valley brought with it the smell of scorched prayers. Old Zhao, the fisherman, was the first to speak of it aloud. He'd been on the water since boyhood, carving through the mist at dawn with his thin paddle, casting his net with a practiced brace, humming to the spirits who lived beneath the current. He said nothing for days after the coffin burned, only watched. But on the 7th morning, he came back pale, not afraid, not shaking, just drained, like something had taken not his life, but his reflection. That morning he stood in the middle of the village square, held out his hand, and dropped something onto the stone. It was a fragment of bone, blackened, cracked, still wet from the river. He said, "I found it in my boat, and I was not alone when I did." No one asked what he meant, but no one doubted it either. They say a mist had settled too thick that morning, that something had knocked from the underside of his boat 3 times, slow and deliberate, before the bone surfaced, that his reflection looked up at him and smiled. The next day he didn't go out, nor the day after that, and on the 3rd day Zhao was gone, not dead, not drowned, gone, as if the river had claimed him without ripples or warning. Only his boat remained, gently drifting back and forth in the reeds, tied to nothing, as though waiting for a passenger who hadn't yet been born. The village fell quiet after that. They tried to seal the fire again. The monks came. They chanted from dawn until dusk, ringing bells so hard that their palms blistered. But the ash only rose higher, and the river kept breathing. Pai, the boy who had touched the coffin, began to dream in smoke. He would wake with the scent of old wood in his nose and the sensation that his lungs were full of fog. His mother would shake him, panicked, when he stopped breathing for moments too long. But it wasn't fear in his eyes when he opened them. It was something else. Recognition. He began walking alone to the river each morning, saying he needed air. But the villagers saw him standing at the banks long after the sun had risen, murmuring to the current. One morning, a girl followed him. Her name was Niran. She was small, sharp, and braver than most of the grown men. She watched from behind a stand of sugar palms as Pai knelt by the river and whispered a name she didn't recognize, over and over to the wind. And the river answered. It wasn't a word, not a voice. It was movement, a slow spiral in the water that circled in place, never drifting, even against the current. Ash gathered in its center like a mouth trying to form sound, and then the smoke lifted. Not like mist, not like fog, like memory. And in that moment, Niran saw a figure behind Pai, tall, unmoving, with arms folded like the fire image people paint on monastery walls. But it had no face, only a shimmer where features should be. She ran, didn't speak for days. Her parents thought it was a fever, but she wasn't sick. She was listening,
because now even the wind had voices. The elders began to meet more often, but they spoke in circles. Some said the coffin had been a punishment, the remains of someone denied burial too long. Others said it was never meant for Bon San Noi, that perhaps it had floated down from another village, a cursed relic seeking fire to complete its pain. But one old woman, May Kam, who had not spoken in over 6 years since her husband passed, finally broke her silence. She said she knew the name Pai had been whispering. Pry, the name of a child who died 30 years ago, burned in a forest fire that had spread from a careless cremation, a boy whose ashes had never been found, whose bones were never given rites, who was said to have wandered for years, half-burned, crying in the wind for someone to remember his name. The village went cold. May Kam said she had seen him once, by the river, at dusk, where the water turned red, but the sky stayed gray. She said he had no eyes, only fire where grief should be. The monks were called again. They prepared paper boats with prayers and candles, ready to send them down the river, offerings of peace for a soul without rest. They lit the boats at twilight, chanting softly, letting them float downstream in silence. But none of them moved. The river held them, as if unwilling to carry the prayers away. The candles burned lower, lower, and instead of going out, they flickered inward, each flame twisting into itself and turning black. Then the boats sank, all at once, and for the first time, the river steamed, not from heat, but from something colder than fire, something watching. After that, the water turned bitter, not by taste, but by sound. Every time it passed over rocks, it hissed instead of babbled. Children swore they saw faces beneath the ripples. Some said they heard footsteps pacing the banks when no one stood there. But the worst part was what began to appear in the sand. Not footprints, teeth, small, burnt, embedded into the earth like seeds waiting to grow. They gathered them in jars, not knowing what else to do. And in the days that followed, those jars began to crack from the inside, as if the teeth remembered the fire, as if they missed it.
His name was Vuthin, and he didn't believe in ghosts. Not because he was brave, not because he was foolish, but because belief had cost him once. Years ago, when he'd prayed to a spirit tree for his wife's safe childbirth, she bled out before the rooster crowed. Since then, Vuthin didn't bow, didn't chant, didn't light incense. The only thing he trusted was work, and work meant soil. He was a farmer, the last who still dared to sow near the cremation ground. When the cursed fire refused to die, most villagers avoided the whole slope, but Vuthin saw something else, the blackened ash drifting down onto the fields like a slow blessing. The rice stalks near the cremation pit had begun to grow taller, greener, unnaturally so. That was all he needed to know. He began to gather the ash. At dawn, when the mist was still curled around the trees like sleeping serpents, he walked with a clay jar to the edge of the pyre. He didn't touch the flames, only what the fire left behind. The ash was warm, even after days, soft like flour, but with weight. It clung to the skin longer than dust should. It didn't scatter in wind. It fell in strange, spiraling patterns. Sometimes it moved on its own, like it had remembered the shape of breath. He didn't care. He took it home, mixed it with water,
spread it over his fields like old fertilizer. And his rice blossomed, greener than any season before, stalks taller than a man's shoulder, leaves that never withered even in full sun. The village whispered about it. Some said he was lucky, others said he'd made a deal. A few crossed themselves when they passed his land, but they didn't see what he saw. At night, the fields glowed. Not brightly, just a faint shimmer, like moonlight caught in dew. But the glow never moved with the wind. It pulsed, like breath, like a memory waking up beneath the soil. One night, he dreamed of his wife. She stood in the rice field, her back to him, hair wet, gown scorched, silent. When he called to her, she didn't turn, but the rice around her shifted, as if something underneath was crawling to the surface. He woke with ash in his mouth. Not the taste, the substance. Grainy, bitter, warm. And on the floor beneath his bed, a trail of footprints, bare, wet, blackened. He didn't stop. Instead, he returned to the pyre and took more. This time, he didn't use a jar. He used his hands. And that was the night the ash clung back. It didn't rest on his palm. It entered it, sank through his skin like ink soaking paper. He cried out, dropped to his knees and clawed at the dirt. But the burning wasn't pain. It was remembering. He saw faces, not with his eyes, behind them. Memories that weren't his. A child with no name buried under floorboards. A woman screaming as her coffin lid closed. A monk with fire in his throat and a smile on his lips. Their last moments etched themselves into his bones like tattoos written in flame. And when he stood up, his hands weren't blackened. They were glowing, faintly, with a soft orange light that pulsed once, then faded. That night, Vuthan couldn't sleep because the fields were whispering. Not the wind, not insects. Whispers, soft, repeating, calling him by name. He walked barefoot into the rice, following the sound. And the stalks parted for him, not like grass in wind, like arms in welcome. In the very center of the field, where he'd scattered the most ash, the earth had sunk slightly. A shallow pit, nothing more. But inside, he saw something glowing. He knelt, reached, pulled up what he thought was stone. But it was a tooth, human, burned black, still warm. The moment he touched it, the field went still. All whispering stopped. Even the wind froze. He looked up and saw them. Figures between the stalks. Dozens. No faces, no eyes, just outlines glowing faintly like coal buried beneath snow. Some small, some towering, all unmoving, watching. He stumbled back, fell, but they didn't chase. They waited, as if he was the one who had strayed and now needed to return. He ran home, locked every door, burned incense for the first time in 15 years. But it was too late. The next day, the rice began to rot, from the inside out. The stalks remained tall, green, perfect, but when you split them, the grains were black, hollow, filled with ash that bled from the veins of the plant. No birds came, no insects buzzed, no dew formed, only smoke, light, barely visible, rising from the soil even in daylight. He tried to burn the fields, but the fire would not catch, not on the rice, not on the ash, not on the wood, as if the land itself had turned fireproof, or worse, as if it already held fire inside. The villagers came to see. No one spoke, but everyone felt it. The heat beneath the soles, the silence too thick for air. One elder wept. "This is not rice," she whispered. "This is memory." Vuthan locked himself inside. He didn't eat, didn't drink. The next night someone heard him screaming, not from pain, but from grief, as if every death he'd never seen was now living inside him. The door remained closed. By morning, it was open, but he was gone. Only the bed remained, covered in black ash. And on the wall, written with a finger dipped in soot, was, "I saw her again. She is not alone." The cremation ground had once been sacred, long before the fire that would not die, before the nameless coffin, before the ash began to whisper. The villagers of Ban Sayen Nai treated the fire pit as hallowed earth, a place to part with the dead, a place to cleanse grief. But now it was different. Even the monks refused to walk too close. They chanted from the edges, never near the flame, never with their eyes open too long. And yet, despite the warnings, despite the salt rings and protective charms nailed into the trees, one woman returned. Her name was Shriwan, a widow. Her husband had died 5 winters ago, burned in the very same fire pit before it had turned strange. She'd come to accept his passing, or at least learned how to carry it like an old scarf, wrapped tightly, faded, warm in cold seasons. But something had changed. She'd begun dreaming of him again, not how he was, but how he died, and not in memory, in heat. In each dream she stood by the cremation ground, and the flame never stopped. Her husband stood in the middle of it, untouched, neither speaking nor burning. His eyes were empty, but his hands were folded in prayer, always facing something below the fire, something she could not see. After the 5th dream, she returned to the pit. She went alone. No one saw her leave. No one dared follow. She arrived before dawn, with a spade in her hand and her hair tied back with black ribbon. The fire was low, still alive, a quiet breath in the dark. It glowed like a memory caught in embers. She bowed once, then stepped beyond the salt line. Nothing stopped her. No wind shifted. No bird called. Not even the crickets made a sound. She knelt at the edge of the fire and pressed her hand to the ground, warm, but not scorched. And when she began to dig, the soil gave way easily, as if something had been waiting to be uncovered. She expected to find roots, stones, old fragments of past cremations. She did not expect fabric, rough, stiff, burnt on the edges, wrapped tightly around something, bound with a thread the color of dried blood. She dug faster, heart pounding with a rhythm she didn't recognize as her own. The cloth was wrapped around an object no larger than a child's skull. It throbbed faintly with warmth. Carefully, she peeled it back. Inside was a shrine, small, handmade, worn from years underground. A wooden figurine sat in its center, no face, no eyes, only a scorched head with a deep hollow where a mouth should be. Around it were tiny offerings, teeth, bits of hair, pieces of charred fingernails tied with silk. There was a name carved at the base, not one she recognized, but as her fingers traced the characters, she heard it whispered aloud, not by her lips, but from beneath the earth. Chao sang. She froze. She did not speak it again. But the name repeated, slowly, softly, like a prayer returning after generations of silence. And with each repetition, the fire behind her rose, not higher, deeper. It didn't grow, it sank into itself, collapsing down into a spiral of flame so slow and steady it felt like watching a wound open in reverse. And inside that spiral, stairs, stone steps slick with soot, curving down into a darkness that pulsed like a heartbeat. She didn't move. She didn't need to. The figurine was gone, vanished from her hands. But her hands still felt warm, as if she held something breathing. Behind her, the fire had stilled. No crackling, no heat, only the sound of wind, sighing like it was afraid. She turned, and at the edge of the spiral, something stood. Not a person, not a ghost, a shape, wrapped in cloth, with a mouth carved wide in place of a face, just like the figurine, but larger. Its arms were folded, not in peace, in restraint, and between its hands, her husband's prayer beads. She stepped forward, not because she wanted to, because something in her legs had forgotten to resist. Each step made her chest ache. Each breath carried the scent of her wedding night, jasmine oil and firewood. She stopped only when she reached the spiral. And then the shape spoke, not with voice, but with ash. A column of it rose, twirling like smoke into her face, shaping words into her mind. You burned him without his name. Sriwan fell to her knees. The voice continued. You fed him to fire, but not to memory. You offered flame, but no guide. She wept, because she understood. She had done the ritual, but she had not believed. Not in the chants, not in the gods, not in the dead's need to be led. She had simply watched him burn. And now he wandered. And the shrine, this strange buried idol of no known god, had taken him. Because flame consumes, but fire remembers. The cloth figure unfolded its arms slowly. The beads dropped to the soil, and beneath them, written in the ash, a single line appeared. Return him to me by his true name, or he will never leave. The spiral of flame collapsed inwards. The figure vanished. And the fire roared once more, wild, open, angry. Sriwan stumbled back. She did not scream. She bowed, then took the beads, pressed them to her chest, and walked home. She would return, but next time she would not come to dig. She would come to kneel, because something slept beneath the fire, and it was not done remembering.
Ghost Festival came late that year. The moon was heavy and orange, like an eye that hadn't blinked in days. Smoke clung low in the fields, slinking between tree trunks, coiling under eaves. No one said the word haunted, but the silence in Ban Sen Noi had taken on weight. It had been weeks since the fire refused to die. The villagers had stopped counting the days. Only the ash kept track now, coating rooftops, slipping through shutters, nestling into beds as if it had always lived there. But the festival could not be ignored. Even in fear, even in silence, the spirits had to be fed. Children folded paper boats and lotus lanterns by candlelight. Elders wrote names in red ink, careful not to press too hard. Incense was lit before dawn, and offerings were placed on bamboo trays at the doorsteps. Sweet rice, salted fish, banana coins made of gold foil. At dusk, they gathered by the river. The current moved slow that night, too slow. The surface was smooth as oil, as if holding its breath. Pai stood at the water's edge with a lantern in his hands. It was small, made of rice paper stretched over a wire frame, painted with the symbol for return. Inside, a single flame flickered, quiet and still. He had made it himself, and though he said nothing, everyone knew it was for someone he would not name. Dozens of villagers lined the bank. Each one cradled a lantern. Each face reflected firelight, shadows tugging beneath their eyes like years lived too fast. The head monk, old and trembling, stepped forward and raised his hand. May these lights guide those who wander. May they find peace in the drift. They released them. Dozens of lanterns kissed the water at once, soft and slow. They were meant to float downstream, past the bend, into the forest river beyond, where the wind would scatter the prayers like pollen. But none moved. The river held them. The lanterns bobbed gently, like cradles on a still tide. The flames stayed upright, unmoving. The current did not pull. The water did not ripple. The villagers murmured. A few stepped forward, poking the river with long sticks to set the boats free. Still, they stayed. Then, one of the flames turned blue. Just one. It pulsed once, twice, then spread. The lantern beside it shifted color, then another, and another. Soon, every flame burned blue, a cold, ghostly hue, the color of bone under candlelight, the color of breath you shouldn't see. Children began to cry. The monks began to chant, but the river did not care. Then came the sound. Not a splash, a knock. From beneath, soft, hollow, repeating, knock, knock, knock. One by one, the lanterns began to turn in place, not drifting, spinning, slowly, like they were being stirred by a finger too deep to see. And then they sank. Each flame extinguished, not by water, but by silence. No steam, no hiss, no struggle, just gone. The villagers backed away. Some ran. Only Pai remained. He stared at the water, hands trembling. The blue glow had disappeared, but the river still held the shape of the lanterns, dark outlines just below the surface, unmoving, like eyes waiting to open. The head monk approached, voice quivering. We must not release light into cursed water again. Something is watching, something hungry. Pai turned to him, and for a moment, he didn't look like a child. He looked like something that had seen too much.
They weren't hungry, he said softly. They were answering. That night, every home kept its doors shut, but it didn't help, because the lanterns returned. Not in boats, in windows. People woke up to find blue flames hovering just beyond the glass, unmoving, silent, steady. No breeze, no flicker, just the soft glow of something that should have died, refusing to go out. One by one, the homes were marked. Not all, only the ones who had released a lantern, and always near dawn, when the air was coldest and the world was too tired to fight back. Lanterns appeared in doorways, hanging from trees, floating beside beds. Some villagers tried to snuff them out. They could not. Cloth burned, paper blackened, but the flame remained dancing inside the smoke, never smaller, never hotter. One man buried his lantern. It returned the next night, still lit, resting on his pillow. He left the village before morning. No one saw him again. The monks warned the people not to engage. Do not look directly at the flames. Do not speak to them. Do not offer names. But names were already being whispered, because some villagers began to hear voices, not from the flame, but behind it. Voices of the dead, whispering old apologies, soft songs, phrases only the listener would recognize. A mother heard her daughter, who drowned during monsoon years ago. A grandfather heard the voice of his father, calling him to dinner in a tone that no longer existed. And Pi heard breathing, just breathing. But he recognized it, because it was the way his father used to breathe, the last nights before he died, lungs burning from illness, struggling but not yet giving in. The lantern at his window never left. Even in rain, even in wind, it stayed. He no longer tried to chase it away, because he understood. It wasn't the dead asking for peace. It was the forgotten asking to be remembered. But the fire never rests, and light that refuses to fade is never alone.
The monk arrived with the fog. He came on the 9th night of the ghost moon, barefoot and draped in robes darker than dusk. No one saw him enter Ban San Noi. No one saw him on the path. He was simply there, at the edge of the village well, his bowl empty, his eyes shut, his head bowed low, as if listening to something beneath the soil. They called him Ajahn Ket, but he never gave a name. He did not speak for the first 2 days. He simply watched, sat beneath the tamarind tree at the edge of the cremation ground, unmoving, as the cursed fire continued its low, slow burn. He watched the smoke drift sideways even when there was no wind, watched the ash spiral upwards and fall again like snow that remembered heat. Children avoided him, animals wouldn't go near, but the elders, they understood. When monks appear without invitation, it is because something sacred has been broken. On the 3rd day, Ajahn Ket finally spoke, and when he did not address a crowd. He spoke only to the ground. The coffin was not cursed when it arrived. It was cursed long before your village, long before your fire. The head monk approached him, eyes narrowed. Then what was it? Ajahn Ket turned slowly, his voice as soft as smoke,
rising through a funeral veil. A debt paid in parts. He held up a bundle wrapped in black cloth. Inside were teeth, not from one person, from many. Large molars, small milk teeth, crooked fangs, all blackened at the root, all burned. "Do you know what binds a soul to fire?" the monk asked. The elder shook his head. A Jonquette unwrapped a second cloth. Inside it, a wooden slat, no longer than a forearm, lacquered with soot. Upon it, tiny grooves, not carved, but worn smooth, as if chewed. A coffin is not just a container, it has a witness. He looked toward the fire. And someone built that witness from memory, from pieces of the dead who were never given peace. The crowd that had gathered stepped back. "What do you mean, pieces?" someone dared to ask. A Jonquette stood, slowly. Every movement of his body seemed older than it should be, like his bones carried the weight of every funeral he'd ever attended. He said, "There is an art, long forgotten, a heresy in the old kingdoms." He pointed toward the flames. "That building a coffin from those who were denied rest, not wood, not bamboo, but fragments, bone, hair, teeth, the remains of wanderers and outcasts, souls unmoored." He turned, "And if such a coffin is burned, it does not release, it remembers." The fire behind him surged, as if in agreement. The crowd trembled. A Jonquette stepped toward the edge of the pit, his feet bare, the ash curling beneath him like threads of silk. "I have seen this before, once." He looked far off, not in distance, but in time. In a village buried by its own prayers, where every house held a shrine that whispered in its sleep, where the wind rang like bells made of teeth. He knelt, touched the earth, closed his eyes, and spoke again, but not in words the villagers understood. A chant, soft, circular, heavy with vowels that bled together like oil on water. The ash rose, not from wind, from listening. The fire quieted. For a moment the world bent, and the villagers saw it in the pit, not flame, not ash, but a shape, the silhouette of a coffin hovering within the smoke, and upon its surface not carvings, but rows of teeth, embedded into its sides like warnings, some large, some tiny, some still bloody at the root. Agent Ket opened his eyes and whispered, "They made it with their mouths." The villagers stood in stunned silence. "What does it want?" someone finally asked. Agent Ket did not answer at first. Then, "It wants the last tooth." A gasp. The coffin is not complete. Something is missing. A final piece. A promise left unfulfilled. He turned toward the village, and until it is given, the fire will not sleep. That night the dreams returned, more vivid, more personal. People saw their own teeth falling from their mouths one by one, landing in bowls of blood and fire. Some woke up with blood on their pillows, some with molars cracked in half, others with empty gums they didn't remember losing. A young girl, barely 9 years old, began to hum an old funeral tune in her sleep. When her mother shook her awake, the child said, "I was helping build the box." Another man awoke screaming, holding a single tooth in his hand. "It was mine, but not from this life." The head monk called a meeting. A Jonquette stood in its center. "We must return the last piece. We must finish the coffin," the villagers cried. But the monk shook his head. "You do not end a curse by completing it." He looked to the fire. "You end it by refusing it. They stared. What does that mean? Ajanquet's eyes darkened. It means someone must keep the memory without becoming the fire. No one understood, but Pai did. He stood up from the back of the crowd, silent, opened his palm, and in it a tooth, old, cracked, burned, still glowing. He didn't say where it came from. He only said, "It called me." Ajanquet bowed, and the fire behind them whispered like breath through gritted teeth. Because some coffins hold bodies, and others wait to be born.
It began with the children, not in nightmares as before, not in whispers or sleepwalking or waking to find ash in their hair. This time, it began with play. The children of Ban San Noi had long since been told not to go near the cremation pit. But children do not remember the way adults do. Their fear does not calcify. It flickers, it dances, it fades. And so, when the fire cooled just enough to stop roaring, when the smoke no longer blackened the sky, when the ash no longer rose in spirals, the children returned, quietly, barefoot, curious. They found the old clay behind the shrines, the earth softened by decades of incense water and monsoon runoff, rich, red, cool to the touch. They began to shape it. At first, they made animals, birds with crooked wings, cats with too many tails, monkeys with eyes too far apart. But then they started making boxes, not rectangular, not square, long, narrow, some with tiny notches, some with lines scratched into their sides, shapes that resembled coffins. The adults didn't notice at first. Children play, children make things. What mattered was that they were quiet, focused, peaceful. Until the singing started. It wasn't a song anyone taught them. There were no words, just sounds, low, repeating, circular, like a chant heard from under a floor. One child hummed it for hours without blinking. Another tapped the rhythm with sticks on a stone. A third whispered the melody into the ear of a sleeping dog, who whimpered in its dreams and refused to enter the house again. Parents asked where the song came from. The children only shrugged. We just knew it. Ajanquet was the first to notice the pattern. He stood beside one child, a girl named Lin, who shaped her clay slowly, deliberately, with her eyes closed. He listened to her hum, and his face went pale. "It's an old offering song," he whispered, "one used only once during the construction of spirit prisons." The villagers gathered. "What are spirit prisons?" someone asked. Ajanquet hesitated. "It's a forbidden rite," he said, "from the north, older than the kingdoms. They believed that if a soul could not be purified by water or fire, it could be bound instead, contained, not freed, not punished, only trapped." He picked up one of the clay boxes the children had made, held it to his ear, and listened, then dropped it. "What did you hear?" they asked. He did not answer, but his hands were shaking. That night, the clay figures began to sing on their own, not loudly, not clearly, just faint vibrations, soft humming like wind through bone. The villagers locked them away, sealed them in jars, buried them, burned them, but they always returned, left at the doorstep, in baskets, on beds. Some were warm to the touch,
others wet with red clay that never dried, and the children kept humming, kept shaping, until one night all the clay figures vanished, every last one, gone, even from locked cabinets, even from burial pits sealed with salt and thread. The next morning, scorch marks were found outside every home, not large, not dangerous, just the perfect shape of a box, like the earth had remembered being burned. Pi saw them too, but what disturbed him wasn't the shapes, it was the trail they left. Every scorch mark formed a path, a line, all pointing toward one place, the cremation pit. Ajahn Ket walked the path alone at dawn. He reached the fire, still burning low, still pulsing like a wound. He knelt, placed his palm against the ash, and heard it. The song, not from the clay, from below, deep beneath the fire, a chorus of children humming the same melody, in perfect rhythm, as if shaped from the same mold. He whispered to the flame, "What are you building?" And the flame answered, not in words, but in breath. It exhaled, and from the ash rose a single figure, a clay doll, wet and red, with no face, no eyes, no limbs, only a tiny mouth, open wide in silent scream. Ajahn Ket bowed and whispered, "It is not a curse." He stood. "It is a cradle."
It began with a boy named Don. Quiet, ordinary. The kind of child who never wandered too far, never spoke too loud, never asked questions the elders didn't want to answer. He had not gone to the fire. He had not touched the clay. But he had breathed it, the ash that drifted in through windows left ajar, the dust that danced in afternoon sunbeams as though weightless. His mother found him scratching, first just at his arms, then the neck, then under his eyes. He said it itched, but when she looked closer, there was nothing. No rash, no bite, no redness, only a faint shimmer clinging to his skin like powdered charcoal. She washed him, scrubbed hard. The shimmer returned the next morning, but this time it glowed. Not brightly, just a trace of warmth beneath the skin, pulsing like fireflies buried under flesh. And then he started speaking in someone else's voice, not a different pitch, a different rhythm, a cadence that did not belong to a child. At first, it was murmurs in sleep, then full sentences in a dialect the mother had never heard. She took him to the temple. The monks surrounded him in chant. He laughed, not as Don, as someone older, someone who had burned. "Where is my mouth?" he asked, looking at his own fingers. "Where is my last breath?" They held him down, bathed him in holy water. The shimmer faded, for a time. But then it came for others. A woman woke with her hands stained gray, her fingernails lined with ash. She hadn't touched the cremation pit, hadn't stepped near the shrines, but her dreams were filled with smoke that whispered her childhood's secrets. A farmer's skin began to peel, not with pain, but with silence. Each layer flaked away like pages of a diary burned too late. Underneath, his veins glowed faintly orange at night. Children came to school with soot along their spines. Mothers wept without reason. And then came the repetition. Phrases began repeating themselves, unprompted. "I forgot the name. I forgot the name. I forgot the name." Villagers spoke in loops, their voices soft, mechanical, detached. Ajahn Ket recognized the signs. He gathered them, not for exorcism, for listening. He asked questions,
What do you see in the ash? What does it remember? What does it want? One by one the afflicted answered, not in words they chose, in fragments that had once been lives. A man spoke of a wedding night no one had known about, held under candlelight beside a hidden riverbank. He wept for a wife who never existed in this life. A girl described the moment the coffin lid closed too early, her lungs still full of air, her fists pounding against wood as the first flames licked at her toes. A mother began to sing lullabies in a language spoken before the mountains had names. None of them remembered saying these things afterward. The ash did. Ajahn Ket collected it, brought jars of it to the monastery. He heated it over low flame. It shimmered, moved, not with wind, not with heat, with memory. It curled into symbols, letters, scripts not written in generations, and then it formed a single image, over and over again, a face, mouth wide open, no eyes, no ears, only a gaping oval where a scream had once tried to escape. The monks fell silent. One stepped forward, trembling. This is the one who swallowed the name. Ajahn Ket nodded. He is not seeking revenge. He is seeking recognition. But how do we give it to him? Ajahn Ket looked down at the ash curling around his bare feet, clinging like fog that wanted to become flesh. We don't. He closed his eyes. We let him wear us. That night, the villagers were instructed not to bathe, not to wipe the ash away. Let it settle. Let it find the shape it remembers. And it did. Across their arms, their backs, their chests, some bore shapes of old tattoos they never had. Others found writing they couldn't read etched into their thighs, their ribs, across their throats. A man found a name written under his tongue. When spoken, it made the fire sigh. A woman woke to find ash around her eyes, painted like a funeral mask. She did not scream. She smiled and whispered, "I remember now," then fell silent forever. Her body turned warm, not hot, warm, like something resting, something released. Ajahn Ket watched the villagers change. They were not possessed. They were becoming vessels for memory too sacred to burn and too heavy to forget. Because some ash can be brushed away, but other ash clings.
The first time it happened, it was gentle. No shrieking, no terror. Just the curl of smoke in a quiet room, shifting against the candlelight like someone breathing behind a silk curtain. And a name, whispered with the weight of memory. Suda. Not loud, not angry, just there. Suda sat upright on her bamboo mat, heart steady but confused. She was alone. The incense had burned low, the windows were shut, but the smoke still danced, not rising, not fading, only lingering, like a thought that hadn't finished forming. She said nothing, and the smoke twisted, formed a face. Her sister's face. Not as she had died, twisted in fever, sweating through her final breath, but younger, whole, calm. Floating in the gray fog, her eyes were closed, her lips moved, but no sound came. Suda leaned closer, and then the lips stopped. The smoke unraveled. Gone. She didn't tell anyone. Not that night, not even the next. But it returned. Night after night, just before dawn. Sometimes forming only an outline, sometimes staying longer,
sometimes moving around the room like it was searching for something that didn't exist anymore. Then it spoke again. This time not her name, but a phrase. They lit it too soon. Suda's blood ran cold, because those were the exact words she had screamed the day her sister died, when the cremation was rushed, the body still warm, the monks hurrying under the pressure of an oncoming storm. She had never told anyone she believed her sister wasn't fully gone. Never said aloud how the fingernails still felt soft. Never confessed that she thought her sister had blinked once, right before the fire swallowed her. Now the smoke knew. "Who told you that?" she whispered. The smoke rippled. Then the lips moved again. "She's not alone." Suda cried, not from fear, but from guilt, because in her silence she had buried more than a body, and now something was unearthing it. The next night the smoke didn't form her sister, it formed her mother, the one who had died when Suda was a girl, the one whose face she had forgotten except in dreams. This time the smoke hovered longer, the lips moved slower, and a name emerged, one Suda didn't know. Chao sang. The name returned again and again, always from different faces. The faces of the dead, neighbors, relatives, strangers, all appearing in the smoke, always with the same expression, solemn, tender, exhausted, as if they had been carrying something too long. Suda began writing the name down, on cloth, on wood, on leaves. The ink bled, the cloth tore, the leaves curled into ash without flame. The name resisted being kept. A Han Ched came to her home, sat in silence as she described the smoke, the faces, the voices. When she finished, he bowed his head. A Han is not a spirit, it is a path, memory carried by heat, words too soft for the living ear. She asked, "Then what are they trying to say?" He answered, "They are trying to give you back what was taken." That night she lit no candles. She simply sat in the dark and waited. The smoke came, soft, swirling. This time it did not form a face. It formed a mouth. Only a mouth, wide, open, trembling, and a phrase poured out. "We are still burning." She whispered, "How do I stop it?" The mouth smiled, not cruelly, just tired, and vanished. The next morning Suda walked to the cremation ground. She stood before the fire, closed her eyes, and inhaled. The smoke filled her lungs. It burned, not painfully. It burned like memory, sharp, heavy, and familiar. She opened her eyes, and for a moment saw them. Hundreds, standing in the ash, hands folded, mouths open. No eyes, no tongues, only breath. She bowed, whispered the name again. Chao sang. The wind shifted, the fire lowered, and the smoke, for the first time, fell still. Because some voices scream to be heard, but others just want to rest.
The temple bell had not rung in weeks. It hung from its old wooden frame at the edge of the monastery courtyard, a bronze curve dulled by time and soot. The rope had frayed. The clapper hadn't swung since the day the fire began. Not because the monks had forgotten, because they were afraid. They whispered that the sound no longer rose to heaven, it sank into the earth.
that when it was last rung, the ground answered back, but tradition demanded its return. It was the eve of Wan Pra, the holy day. The fire still burned, the smoke still shifted with names, the ash still whispered in sleep, and the dead, it seemed, were still listening. A Janket stood beneath the bell, palms folded. Around him the villagers gathered. No one spoke. He turned to them. The bell must be rung, not to summon the spirits, but to remind them that we remember. He pulled the rope. The bell did not move. He pulled again. A dull sound, metal struggling against silence. Then a crack, faint, from within. The monks stepped back. A Janket knelt, placed his hand upon the base, and felt it, warmth, too much for cold bronze, like flesh heated from within. He ordered the bell lowered. They resisted, but he insisted. With trembling hands, the monks unhooked it, lowered it to the ground, and turned it on its side. Inside, something rolled. Not dust, not rust, a shape. They peered in and found bones, tiny, hollow, pale. Not wood, not metal, but finger bones, bound together in a circle, tied with red thread. Someone made a bell from the dead, a Janket whispered. One monk wept. This was never meant to be rung. But it already had. They tried to remove the bones. They crumbled to ash, and from the center of that ash, a sound, soft, faint, like a breath exhaled beneath a chant. And then the wailing began. Not from above, from below. The ground vibrated, soil cracked, and the cremation pit roared, not with flame, but with voices. Hundreds, no longer whispering, now weeping, long, slow, sorrowful sobs echoing as if from within the bell itself. Suda fell to her knees. It's the ones who were never heard, she whispered. Pai stepped forward, held his ear to the rim of the bell, and his face turned white. They're asking to come out. A Janket stood still, then whispered, No. They are asking to be let in. The villagers panicked. Some fled. Others shouted to destroy it, to bury the bell, to melt it, to drown it. A Janket raised his hand. No more denial. He turned to the fire and carried the bell there himself. Every step made the voices louder, not screaming, singing, a funeral song, ancient, wordless, circular, like the chant the children had hummed when shaping their clay coffins. He set the bell in the ashes. The flames recoiled, hissed, spat sparks that shimmered blue. Then silence, total. Not a bird, not a breath, not even the wind. And then the bell rang, on its own. One deep note, low, final. A sound that did not rise into the sky. It sank into the soil, echoed beneath their feet, and the fire went still. Not dead, sleeping. The monks bowed. A Janket folded his hands and whispered, It is not finished, but now we hear it. The villagers left slowly, one by one, but Pai remained. He stood beside the bell as night fell, staring into its hollow shape. He leaned close and heard one last voice, not loud, not angry, not even in pain, just tired. It said, Let me be shaped again. And the bell glowed with the color of teeth. The wind stopped the night he made his choice. It did not die. It paused, as though the world held its breath. Ajahn Ket sat alone beneath the Bodhi tree, wrapped in stillness. The air was warm, too warm for night. Around him the monastery hummed with unspoken prayers. Every monk knew, every villager could feel it. Something was coming. For weeks he had studied the ash, listened to the smoke, watched the fire's heartbeat slow and rise again. He had seen faces in lanterns. He had touched memory in bone. He had heard the echo of names no one dared keep alive. But now he had heard something else, a request. The fire wanted a witness, not a victim, not a sacrifice, a witness. And Ajahn Ket knew, there are some rituals no one can teach, only remember. He rose before dawn, dressed in clean robes, bare feet, shaved head, silent mouth. He walked to the cremation pit. It was burning slow, steady, a quiet breath beneath the soil. No one tried to stop him. Not the villagers who watched from behind shutters, not the monks who stood in still rows, palms folded, not the wind which had returned just enough to lift the edges of his robe. He stepped beyond the salt lines, beyond the broken charms, beyond the circle that no one had crossed since the coffin first burned, and stood before the flame. It did not reach for him. It did not hiss. It bowed, like an old friend receiving a traveler. Ajahn Ket removed his beads, placed them in the ash, and whispered one word, remember. Then he stepped in. The fire accepted him. No roar, no scream, no burst, just stillness. He stood in the center of the flame, robes glowing, skin untouched. His eyes remained open, his lips moved in silent chant. The monks wept. Fais stepped forward, breath held. Will he die? Someone whispered. But Ajahn Ket was already changing, not burning, transforming. The flame did not consume him. It translated him. His body began to crumble like old parchment, glowing at the edges, ash rising from his shoulders. But his eyes never closed. And when the flame reached his chest, his heart beat once, loud, so loud that the bells in the monastery rang without touch, so loud that the ash in every home stirred as if exhaling. Then he was gone. No bones, no smoke, no robe, only silence. Until the flame moved. It opened, not like a flower, but like a door. And from its center a shape emerged. Not human, not ghost, not God. A figure of ash, shaped in the likeness of Ajahn Ket. Eyes open, palms folded, mouth shut. It stood in the center of the fire and bowed. Then it turned and walked back into the flame. And the fire dimmed, but did not die. That night the villagers heard chanting in their dreams, not from monks, from the fire itself, low, ancient, rhythmic. And in every chant a name was carried, not spoken aloud, but burned into memory. Ajahn Ket had become what the fire could never be, a vessel that chose to stay, because some do not run from the fire. Some walk into it to keep others from being taken.
At first, it looked like driftwood,
just a dark shape caught in the slow churn of the river, rising with the fog as dawn peeled away the edges of the night. But as it drew closer, the villagers who stood on the banks of Ban San Noi saw that it was not drifting. It was moving, deliberately, against the current. The water bent around it, lapping at its edges, but never stopping it. The reeds parted for it, the river bugs fled from it, the wind slowed to match its pace. It was a coffin, black, swollen, splintered at the corners, wet, yet dry, burned, yet intact. Some recognized it immediately. It was the same one, the coffin that had appeared without name, the one that burned and would not die, the one that changed everything. And now it had returned. Pai stood on the riverbank, barefoot in the silt. He said nothing, only watched. The monks arrived in silence. So did the children. No one spoke. The coffin drifted to the shore without a sound and stopped at the exact place where Zhao the fisherman had once vanished. The same reeds, the same bend, the same hush in the trees. But this time, it did not wait. It knocked. 3 times. Low, hollow, from the inside. Knock. 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 A girl screamed. The head monk collapsed to his knees. Ajahn Ket was gone, but his silence remained. It clung to the villagers like humidity, thickening around their hearts. No one dared touch the coffin, except Pai. He stepped forward. The ash that once shimmered on his skin was gone, but something deeper had taken its place. The fire's breath lived in his bones now. You could see it behind his eyes. He knelt beside the coffin, listened, and smiled. Not with joy, but with recognition. It brought itself back, he said softly. Suda stepped forward, trembling. Why? Pai placed his hand on the lid, and the wood sighed, as if grateful to be touched. He whispered, because it remembers who it was made for. That night, the villagers carried the coffin not to the cremation pit, but to the monastery. It did not fight. It did not grow heavy. It floated through the air, weightless in their hands, as if the soul inside had learned how to rest, but not yet how to leave. They laid it on the stone altar. Around it, candles were lit, incense curled toward the rafters. The bell, still cracked, still echoing Ajahn Ket's chant, rang once, without wind. Pai stood beside the coffin and spoke, not as a monk, not as a child, but as someone who had been chosen to carry a memory. This coffin was built from forgotten sorrow, from those who were burned without name, buried without rite, sealed without goodbye. He looked up, eyes glowing faintly in the candlelight. But it was not made to punish. It was made to find. He paused. It was made to find. The monks lowered their heads, and from the coffin, soft breath, no louder than a sleeping infant, exhaled from the cracks. The air smelled of old rice fields, of temple floors, of tears dried too soon. Then came the sound. Laughter. Quiet. Gentle. A child's laughter. Then a woman's hum. Then silence again, because the memories inside were not angry. They were waiting, waiting for someone to return them, not to the fire, but to the river. The villagers understood. At dawn, they lifted the coffin again, carried it back to the shore, and released it. This time, it did not float upstream. It turned, finally, and followed the current, downstream, toward the sea, toward the forgetting. Pi stood and watched until it disappeared around the bend, then whispered. Some fires burn to purify, but this one burned to remember.
For a brief time, the village breathed. The fire had dimmed. The coffin was gone, floating peacefully downriver, its wake cutting soft silence across the surface like a wound closing. The monks chanted every morning. Children returned to their games. Even the air felt lighter, though never quite clean. But on the 7th night after the coffin vanished, the names began. Not whispered, written. It started in the early hours, when the fog still clung low and the sky was the color of burnt silk. Suda was the first to notice it, standing on her porch with a cup of rice water, watching the chimney smoke from the neighbor's kitchen rise. It curled left, then arched right, then spun and stopped, forming 5 strokes in the air. Letters, clear, precise. Her name, written in smoke. She gasped, dropped the cup. It shattered at her feet. She rubbed her eyes. The smoke dispersed. She told no one. But the next day, others saw it too. Above roofs, drifting from cooking fires, spiraling from incense sticks in the temples, even curling from the mouths of sleeping elders, each name different, each written in smoke, each fading only after it had been seen. The village gathered beneath the banyan tree, faces pale, eyes restless. One elder spoke. "I saw my husband's name," she whispered. "He's been dead 12 years." Another said, "I saw mine, in my own handwriting." Ajahn Ket was gone, but the memory of his voice lingered. So it was Phi who stood before them now, quiet, steady. "They're not warnings," he said. "Then what are they?" someone cried. "Curses?" Phi shook his head. "Echoes." He pointed toward the horizon, where the cremation fire had once lived, now only a circle of cracked stone and dust. They're the names that passed through the fire, spoken too late, forgotten too quickly. He paused. And now the fire is returning them. Someone sobbed, but not in fear, in grief, because some of the names had not been spoken in decades. Some had never been spoken aloud at all. Illegitimate children, mothers lost in childbirth, soldiers with no graves, midwives who died in silence, names erased from records, now rising in smoke. And not just of the dead, of the living too. Children saw their own names, scrawled in wisps above their heads. Some asked their parents what it meant. No one had an answer until the first one faded, a man named Komon. He had been seen earlier that morning, chopping wood, laughing. By nightfall, his house was empty. No sign of struggle, no door left open, only smoke lingering in his bed, curling upward in the shape of his name one last time before dissolving. The next day, another name returned, then another. Each time the name appeared, then the person disappeared. Not violently, just gone. And always, the smoke rose. Some tried to escape. They left Bonsen Noi, walked the roads into the hills, but the smoke followed. A traveler returned with stories of names written in the sky above rice fields,
on the backs of cows, even across the face of the moon. Phi called the monks to the temple. He lit the incense and asked the fire aloud, "What do you want now?" The flame danced, spiraled, and rose into the air not as smoke, but as script. One word, witness. The villagers read it, cried, fell to their knees. Suda spoke what no one wanted to hear. We are the last to remember. The fire was not claiming, it was preserving, because the rituals had been broken, the rites abandoned, the names forgotten. Now the fire wrote them down, one final time, into the air so that they might not be lost. A child asked, "But what happens when the last name is written?" No one answered, because that night the names grew longer, more frequent. Some houses saw 3, 4, 5, and when the names disappeared, so did the fire. It went out, not in violence, in peace. And from the ashes rose no smoke, only silence. The kind of silence that knows how to keep a name safe, because memory once released becomes flame, but a name written in smoke never truly leaves.
The fire was gone. For the first time in what felt like seasons, the cremation ground was cold. The stone circle blackened but breathless. The altar still stood, covered in soft ash like snowfall, untouched since the last name vanished into air. No smoke, no wind, no voices, just the stillness of a village remembering how to breathe again. Bonsan Noi moved slowly, carefully, as if it feared waking something. The monks chanted, not to ward off, but to thank. The children no longer sang the clay songs. The river no longer whispered. The bell, cracked and quiet, had not rung since Ajahn Ket walked into flame. Pai sat alone beneath the banyan tree. The last name had appeared 3 days ago, his own. He hadn't run, hadn't cried. He simply watched as the smoke traced each letter, slow and reverent, across the morning air, then faded. But he did not vanish. Not that day, not the next. He waited. And on the 4th morning, he returned to the cremation ground. The others followed, not too close, but near enough to see. He knelt in the center of the circle, placed his palms into the ash. It was still warm, not hot, not burning, just warm, like skin that had held another's hand for too long. He whispered a name, Chao Seng, not as a ritual, but as a goodbye. And then the ashes stirred, only slightly, just enough to pulse once, a soft breath beneath the earth, and from the center of the pit a faint light began to rise. It wasn't fire, it wasn't smoke, it was a glow, gold at first, then blue, then something deeper. The kind of light you see behind your eyelids when dreaming of people you've lost. It rose slowly, swirling above Pai's head, then spread outward. It did not burn, it lit. Each grain of ash across the circle, across the village, began to shimmer. Rooftops, doorsteps, the roots of trees, the corners of beds. A soft glow, as if all the ash in Bonsan Moi had inhaled at the same time. The villagers stepped into the light and saw. They saw faces, hundreds, thousands, not ghosts, memories,
Old women who once boiled rice under starlight, men who carved drums from hollow logs, children who had never cried, lovers who had died before the war ended, midwives, hunters, dancers, sisters, all rising, not to return, but to be known. They smiled, then bowed, and the light lifted, softly, into the sky, and vanished into the first sunrise Bon San Noi had seen without smoke. Pai stood, hands still coated in glowing ash. He turned to the villagers. "He is gone," he said. But no one wept, because gone no longer meant forgotten. Later that evening, as dusk fell, the ashes glowed one last time. No fire, no chant, just light, soft, steady, breathing. And when it faded, all that remained was silence. A good silence, a peaceful one, like a candle being blown out in a room where everyone has already said their goodbyes. From that day on, no one feared the fire. They did not rebuild the cremation pit. They left the ashes where they were, not as warning, but as memory, because the dead do not ask to be held forever, only to be known long enough to let go. And sometimes, if you listen close enough, you can still hear the glow.